The ink on the $10.5 million contract was barely dry, but Clara felt the true cost of her family's love heavier than ever. She sat quietly in the mahogany-paneled office of her attorney, Douglas Whitfield, watching the brass ceiling fan slowly turn. Outside the frosted window panes, the biting mid-November wind of Oakhaven, upstate New York, rattled the glass, stripping the last brittle, brown leaves from the ancient oak trees lining the street. The spacious room smelled of aged paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sharp scent of peppermint from a crystal candy dish on the desk. Clara stared down at her own hands resting in her lap. They were rough, the knuckles weathered and calloused from 20 grueling years of pruning apple trees, tending to organic grapevines, and pulling frost covers before dawn. Those hard-working hands had just signed away the 800-acre agricultural estate she had built from absolutely nothing. 14 signatures. That was all it took to transfer her life's work to a corporate buyer for a sum of money that didn't even feel real to her yet. Beside her, David sat in his sturdy navy pea coat, his presence a quiet, immovable anchor. He didn't say a word as the attorney slid the final manila folder across the polished desk, but his hand found hers under the table, his thumb gently tracing the rough, dry skin of her knuckles. The gesture spoke volumes. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement of the frozen mornings, the financial panics, and the sheer grit that had eventually led them to this very room. Douglas Whitfield closed his expensive fountain pen with a soft click, offered a warm, professional smile, and formally congratulated them. But as Clara stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her practical flannel shirt and adjusting her work boots, the staggering number printed on the paperwork felt less like a hard-won victory and more like an impending storm. The upcoming 40th anniversary dinner for her parents was looming at the end of the week, an extravagant, showy affair at the country club they had been boasting about for months. With this newfound, massive wealth now a reality, Clara knew exactly what would inevitably happen next. The drive back to their modest farmhouse was cloaked in a heavy, contemplative silence. David kept his eyes focused on the winding, frost-lined county roads that cut through the dormant fields. The heater of their trusty, older Ford truck hummed a steady, comforting tune, fighting off the bitter winter chill that always seemed to seep through the floorboards this time of year. The sky above Oakhaven was a bruised, heavy gray, pregnant with the season's first real snow. Usually, they would listen to the local country music station to pass the time, but today, David reached out and clicked the radio off. The sudden quiet inside the cab was thick with the unsaid things that had shadowed their marriage for over a decade. He waited patiently until they had pulled into their own gravel driveway, the tires crunching loudly in the rural stillness, before he finally shifted the truck into park. Inside, the farmhouse was incredibly warm and inviting. The scent of cinnamon and the lingering, nostalgic aroma of morning wood smoke hung in the air. Clara immediately walked over to the kitchen counter, finding a small measure of comfort in the familiar, daily routine of brewing a fresh pot of black coffee. She watched the dark, rich liquid drip into the glass carafe, her mind racing with 100 different anxieties. David took off his heavy coat, draped it carefully over the back of a wooden dining chair, and sat down at the worn oak table. When Clara finally turned around holding 2 steaming ceramic mugs, she saw it. Lying perfectly flat on the table, right next to the porcelain sugar bowl, was David's yellow legal pad. Clara's heart sank slightly. She knew that pad intimately. She set the warm mugs down, wrapping her cold fingers tightly around her own. David flipped the cardboard cover back. The lined page was completely filled with his neat, meticulous handwriting. Dates. Names. Specific dollar amounts. He slowly slid the pad across the table toward her. At the very bottom of the page, a final, tallied number was circled in thick, dark ink. $347,000. It was a staggering, heartbreaking figure. For 15 long years, Clara had been the silent, reliable bank for her parents and her deeply ambitious older sister, Eleanor. Whenever Margaret, their mother, called with a tearful, desperate story about a leaking roof or a sudden, unexpected medical bill, Clara had quietly written a check, often sacrificing her own comfort and farm equipment upgrades to do so. Whenever Eleanor needed a sudden loan to cover her lavish lifestyle or keep up appearances with the elite crowd she so desperately wanted to join, Clara had provided the funds without question. And in return, they had consistently treated her like a dirt-digging failure, an uneducated farmer who was only tolerated when her checkbook was open. David took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His calm, analytical tone cut straight through the cozy warmth of the kitchen. He pointed to the top of the pad. He gently reminded her of the time Eleanor needed emergency funds for a supposed business venture, only to post glowing pictures of a luxury Caribbean vacation the very next week. He recalled the brutal winter Clara had broken her wrist slipping on the barn ice, and not a single family member had driven the 20 miles to check on her. Yet, a mere week later, her mother had called asking for money to upgrade her kitchen countertops for the holidays. "If you tell them about the $10.5 million, David said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, "they will suddenly be the most loving family in the world. They will call you every day. They will invite you to every dinner. And you, Clara, will never, ever know if any of it is real." Clara looked down at the dark, swirling coffee in her mug. The undeniable truth of his words ate, settling as a deep, hollow pain in her chest. She wanted so desperately to believe that her parents loved her for who she was, not for what she could continually provide. She wanted to believe her sister viewed her as an equal, not as an endless resource to fund a superficial life. David reached across the wooden table, covering her trembling hand with his own warm palm. He proposed a test. A simple, deeply painful, but absolutely necessary test. Tell them the truth about losing the farm, but change the ending. Tell them the bank foreclosed. Tell them she was completely bankrupt, that she had lost everything and was left with nothing but insurmountable debt. If they truly loved her, they would rally around her. They would offer comfort, a spare bedroom, a hot meal. But if they reacted the way David suspected they would, Clara would finally have the definitive answer she had been dreading for 15 years. Hot tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes. It felt like a terrible betrayal to lie to her own flesh and blood, yet the yellow legal pad sitting between them was a factual testament to a decade and a half of quiet betrayal she had already endured. She looked at her husband, seeing the fierce, protective love shining in his eyes. He wasn't doing this to be cruel, he was doing this to finally set her free. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her entire childhood, Clara slowly nodded. She stood up from the table, her legs feeling like lead, and picked up her cell phone from the kitchen counter. Her thumb hovered hesitantly over her mother's contact name. The house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the hallway. As the phone rang, Clara braced herself for her mother's comforting voice, terrified of the silence she might find instead. "Before we find out who answers that phone, I want to take a quick moment to speak directly to you. If you are still watching this video and finding value in Clara's journey so far, please drop the number 8 in the comments below just to let me know you are here with us. We all know how heavy it feels to carry the weight of a family's expectations. If this story is hitting close to home and you haven't joined our community yet, I highly recommend you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. Your wonderful support is exactly what helps us keep creating great content to inform, uplift, and inspire you every single day. Now, let's get back to Clara, and let's continue. Silence is never truly empty. Sometimes, it is filled with the sharpest kinds of betrayal. Clara held the phone tightly against her ear, listening to the hollow, static hum of the line connecting to her parents' house. When Margaret finally answered on the third ring, her voice was light, breezy, and completely unaware of the devastating performance her daughter was about to deliver. Clara swallowed hard, her throat feeling like sandpaper, and forced the words out. She explained that the bank had stepped in, that the mounting debts were simply too much to outrun, and that the beautiful organic estate she had poured her soul into had been completely foreclosed upon. She told her mother she was bankrupt, stripped of everything. For a terrible, stretched moment, there was nothing but the sound of Margaret's sharp intake of breath. Clara waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, desperately yearning for the maternal warmth that should instinctively follow such catastrophic news. Instead, a heavy, irritated sigh crackled through the receiver. Margaret did not ask where Clara would sleep, nor did she offer a word of comfort. Her immediate, panicked response was a bitter complaint about the deposit she needed for her upcoming kitchen remodel, lamenting how Clara's sudden financial ruin was incredibly inconvenient timing for the family's holiday plans. Without waiting for Clara to explain further, Margaret muttered a hurried excuse about needing to speak with Arthur and abruptly ended the call. The dial tone echoed in Clara's ear, cold and indifferent. Back at the kitchen table, the yellow notepad of tallied debts remained exactly where it had been, a stark, ink-stained prophecy that had just been fulfilled. David walked over from the living room, holding the family's shared digital tablet. His face was a mask of quiet sorrow. He gently placed the glowing screen in front of Clara without a word. It was a family group messaging thread, one she had been quietly excluded from months prior. As Clara scrolled through the brightly colored text bubbles, her chest tightened. The messages were populating in real time. Margaret had wasted no time. She was already broadcasting Clara's supposed failure to Eleanor, typing frantically about how she always knew the farming business was a foolish, reckless endeavor. Eleanor's replies appeared seconds later, devoid of any sisterly sympathy. She mocked Clara's lack of a proper college degree, dismissing her decades of grueling labor as mere dirt digging that was bound to end in disaster. Clara watched the screen blur through the unshed tears in her eyes. Her father, Arthur, was visibly active in the chat, his red receipts appearing beneath every cruel message, yet he offered not a single syllable of defense for his youngest daughter. His silence was a cowardly endorsement of their mockery. Then, the final, crushing blow appeared on the screen, sent by Margaret in bold, capitalized letters: "Nobody lend her a dime. She did this to herself." The sheer brutality of those words, typed by the woman who had birthed her, knocked the remaining wind out of Clara's lungs. She pushed the tablet away, unable to bear looking at the glowing letters for another second. The walls of the farmhouse suddenly felt entirely too small, pressing in on her with the suffocating reality of her family's conditional love. She needed to breathe. She needed to be anywhere else. Grabbing her heavy wool coat, Clara drove down into the heart of Oakhaven. She pulled into the parking lot of the local diner, a fixture of the community known for its cracked vinyl booths, the perpetual aroma of burnt toast, and the low, steady murmur of small-town life. A bell jingled above the door as she walked in, seeking the anonymous comfort of a hot cup of coffee. However, anonymity was a luxury Oakhaven rarely afforded. As Clara slid into a back corner booth, she noticed the subtle shifts in the room. The usual warm greetings from the neighboring tables were absent. Instead, there were averted eyes, hushed whispers behind laminated menus, and the distinct, pitying glances of people who had already heard the morning's gossip. Margaret had not just abandoned her daughter, she had effectively salted the earth, spreading the narrative of Clara's humiliating financial ruin before lunchtime. The seasoned waitress, a woman who usually lingered to chat about the incoming winter weather, poured Clara's coffee with a stiff, uncomfortable silence and quickly scurried away. Clara wrapped her hands around the thick ceramic mug, staring into the dark liquid. The town was looking at her as if she were a cautionary tale, a foolish woman who had squandered her livelihood. Yet, sitting there amidst the whispers, Clara felt a strange, solidifying calm wash over her. The tears she thought she would shed were entirely gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable clarity. She finished her coffee, taking her time, refusing to cower under the weight of the town's misguided judgment. When she stood up to leave, she deliberately pulled a crisp $10 bill from her pocket and slid it under the edge of her saucer. It was an excessively generous tip for a single cup of black coffee, a quiet, dignified rebellion against the narrative of her poverty. The bitter November wind whipped against her face as she stepped back out into the diner's parking lot, stinging her cheeks but clearing her mind. She drove back toward the farmhouse, the landscape passing by in a blur of gray and brown. She had survived the hardest part of the morning. She knew the truth now, undeniably and permanently. The illusion of family had shattered, but the true test was yet to come. An unexpected vehicle was already pulling into her gravel driveway. In a town like Oakhaven, bad news travels faster than the first winter snow, bringing both vultures and angels to your front porch. Clara pulled her heavy truck into the driveway, the crunch of the tires on the frozen gravel masking the heavy sigh that escaped her lips. The biting cold wind of late Wednesday afternoon whipped across the sprawling yard, biting at her exposed cheeks as she stepped out of the cab. A layer of pale, shimmering frost had already begun to settle over the festive Thanksgiving pumpkins lining the wooden steps of her porch, mirroring the sudden chill that had taken residence in her heart. She hadn't even reached the bottom step when a sleek, silver luxury SUV turned sharply off the main county road, its tires tearing aggressively through the driveway's loose stones. Clara didn't need to see the personalized license plate to know who had arrived. The vehicle slammed into park, and the heavy door swung open. Eleanor marched toward the farmhouse, her expensive, stiletto-heeled leather boots clicking sharply against the frozen earth. She was draped in a tailored cashmere coat that cost more than a month's worth of groceries, her perfectly manicured hands clutching a designer handbag like a shield against the rural landscape. There was no warm greeting, no sisterly embrace to offer comfort in the face of alleged financial ruin. Eleanor stopped at the base of the porch stairs, her breath puffing in angry white clouds in the frigid air. Her perfectly styled hair was practically vibrating with frantic, self-centered energy. Without missing a beat, she launched into a breathless, vicious tirade. She didn't ask how Clara was surviving, she demanded to know what this sudden bankruptcy meant for her own meticulously crafted image. Eleanor was currently campaigning desperately for a coveted seat on the parent board of Oakhaven's most elite private school, an institution where wealth and status were the absolute only acceptable currency. Having a newly destitute, dirt-digging failure of a sister was a catastrophic stain on the flawless family portrait she was trying to sell to the town's upper crust. Clara stood quietly on the porch, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her worn flannel coat, looking down at the sisters she had bailed out time and time again. Eleanor's voice grew shriller, her demands escalating with staggering audacity. She ordered Clara to put the farmhouse on the market immediately, insisting that she was rightfully owed a share of whatever equity remained so she could secure her own social standing and purchase the upscale mansion she had been eyeing. It was a breathtaking display of pure greed, fueled entirely by the panic of losing her personal, reliable source of funding. Clara felt a strange, solid calmness anchor her boots to the wooden floorboards. She looked Eleanor square in the eyes and firmly, unequivocally, said no. The single syllable hung in the freezing air, sharp and absolutely final. Eleanor's face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure contempt. The direct rejection was something she had never experienced from her younger sibling. Spitting out venomous insults, she called Clara a pathetic, uneducated burden who had finally gotten exactly the miserable life she deserved. As she spun on her expensive heels to leave, Eleanor threw one final, calculated dagger over her shoulder. She formally uninvited Clara from their parents' upcoming 40th anniversary celebration. Margaret and Arthur, she sneered, simply could not risk the sheer embarrassment of having the town's newest charity case mingling with their refined country club guests. The heavy SUV door slammed shut, and Eleanor sped away, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of exhaust and the harsh, biting silence of the rural afternoon. Clara sank into the weathered rocking chair on the porch, her breath shaky, pulling her coat tighter against the November chill. The profound cruelty of her own blood was a bitter pill to swallow, freezing her from the inside out. But the universe has a peculiar way of balancing the scales. Barely 10 minutes had passed before the gentle, steady crunch of tires announced another arrival. This time, it was a modest, older sedan. Martha, the 75-year-old retired high school teacher who lived a mile down the road, carefully navigated the frozen driveway. She stepped out, her movements deliberate and soft, carrying a heavy ceramic dish covered with a faded checkered cloth. As Martha approached the wooden porch, the unmistakable, comforting aroma of baked apples, rich butter, and warm cinnamon wafted through the icy air, immediately pushing back the lingering bitterness of Eleanor's visit. She climbed the steps with a warm, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her kind, observant eyes. Martha didn't offer empty, practiced platitudes, nor did she press Clara for the humiliating details of the town's latest gossip. Instead, she simply stated that she had known Clara for 20 long years, she had watched her build an entire estate with her own two calloused hands, and she knew far better than to believe the idle, malicious chatter of the diner crowd. Martha spoke of true character, her voice a soothing balm in the freezing wind, reminding Clara that a person's absolute worth is never measured by the fleeting balance of a bank account, but by the quiet dignity of their daily labor and the steadfast kindness in their heart. Clara's rigid, defensive posture finally broke. The sheer emotional exhaustion of the past 2 days came rushing to the surface, bringing hot tears to her eyes. Martha stepped closer, setting the heavy, homemade pie on the small porch table. Without a single word of pity, the elderly woman reached out and placed a gentle, weathered hand firmly over Clara's cold, trembling fingers. It was a simple, profound touch, the exact, selfless motherly comfort Clara's own flesh and blood had brutally withheld. A single tear slipped down Clara's cheek, not out of sorrow for the family she had lost, but out of profound gratitude for the genuine, unconditional kindness she had finally found in its place. With Martha's pie still warm on the counter, Clara looked at the anniversary dinner invitation she was supposedly uninvited from, and decided it was exactly where she needed to be. Dear friend, sometimes in life, people who aren't related by blood can bring us the warmth of true family, just like how old Martha warmed Clara's heart on a cold winter day. If you're still watching this video and find the messages truly valuable, please comment with a 1 below to let me know you're here. It would be even better if you could take a few seconds to leave a meaningful comment or a kind wish for people with such compassionate hearts as Martha. If you're a new visitor and haven't subscribed yet, I sincerely recommend you press the subscribe button and turn on the little notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. Your wonderful support is a huge motivation for us to continue creating great content, providing information and inspiration for you every day. And now, the decision has been made, and Clara will go to the party. Let's continue the story. Invitations are easily revoked, but they are just as easily reinstated when someone desperately needs a signature. The jarring ring of the telephone shattered the quiet peace of late Friday evening, cutting through the lingering, comforting memory of sweet cinnamon and baked apples from the day before. Outside the farmhouse, the winding roads of Oakhaven were rapidly glazing over with a treacherous layer of slick November ice, mirroring the slippery, hazardous nature of the conversation Clara was about to have. When she lifted the receiver, the voice on the other end was sickeningly sweet. Eleanor, who just 48 hours prior had stood on the frozen porch hurling venomous insults, was now speaking in hushed, affectionate tones. She claimed to have done a great deal of soul-searching. She insisted that, despite Clara's unfortunate financial ruin, family was still family. With a practiced, breathy sincerity, Eleanor demanded that Clara must attend their parents' 40th anniversary celebration the following night. Clara listened to the hollow apology, her posture completely rigid. She could feel the invisible strings being pulled. There was an incredibly specific, desperate undercurrent to her sister's sudden change of heart, a hidden agenda waiting in the wings. Yet, instead of arguing, Clara simply agreed to go. After hanging up, a restless energy pushed Clara toward the small, cluttered home office. She needed to locate a specific tax form for David, a mundane task to settle her racing mind. Sitting in the glow of the desk lamp, she began sifting through a backlog of old emails and digital farm records she had neglected during the chaotic final weeks of the harvest season. As she scrolled, a peculiar, forwarded message caught her eye. It had been sent 6 months ago from Arthur's email address directly to Margaret's, buried beneath a mountain of tractor maintenance invoices. Clara clicked it open, her eyes scanning the plain text. It was an official inquiry from a corporate real estate scout, specifically targeting Clara's organic acreage and highlighting its massive, multi-million-dollar development potential. Beneath the formal inquiry was a brief, damning note typed by her father. He had explicitly confirmed the staggering valuation to her mother. Clara's breath hitched in her throat, the air suddenly feeling incredibly thin. They knew. For half a year, Arthur and Margaret had known that a corporate buyer was willing to pay a fortune for the estate. They had kept this life-changing information a complete secret, actively choosing to hide the truth while simultaneously continuing to cry poverty and drain Clara's bank accounts with manufactured emergencies. This was the ultimate, heartbreaking proof. It wasn't merely a matter of taking her for granted. It was a premeditated, calculated exploitation designed to keep her firmly in her place as their personal, endless resource. In that quiet, dimly lit office, the last fragile thread of Clara's naive hope finally snapped. It was not replaced by tears or despair, but by the unbreakable, cold steel of a woman who had finally seen the absolute truth. She printed the email, the machine whirring loudly in the silence, and carefully folded the crisp paper. Saturday evening arrived with a biting, deep freeze chill that settled deep into the bones. Clara stood before her bedroom mirror, dressing with a simple, understated elegance. She chose a dark, beautifully tailored dress that spoke of quiet, unshakable dignity rather than flashy, insecure wealth. She took the freshly printed email, along with the monumental $10.5 million bank receipt, and tucked them securely into the inner pocket of her leather purse. Downstairs, David was already waiting by the front door, slipping his broad shoulders into his sturdy, familiar navy peacoat. He didn't ask if she was sure about this, his dark eyes simply met hers, offering that profound, silent vow of unwavering support that had carried them through 2 decades of hardship. They stepped out into the freezing night and climbed into the cab of their reliable older Ford truck. The drive toward the affluent side of the county was enveloped in a comfortable, purposeful silence. The truck's heater hummed faithfully, pushing a steady stream of warm air against the icy windshield, a rhythmic counterpoint to the treacherous, frost-covered roads outside. Clara watched the dormant winter trees blur past the glass, her mind incredibly clear, her spine perfectly straight. She was no longer the exhausted, accommodating daughter desperate for scraps of affection. She was stepping into her own power. David pulled the heavy truck into the sprawling, manicured parking lot of the venue, the vehicle looking distinctly out of place among the rows of freshly washed, leased luxury sedans. He shifted the gear into park and reached across the console, giving her hand one final, deeply reassuring squeeze before she opened the door to the biting wind. The glowing chandeliers of the Sterling Country Club looked warm and inviting through the glass, but Clara knew she was walking straight into a room full of well-dressed wolves. 40 years of marriage is a beautiful milestone, unless the foundation is built on borrowed money and buried truths. Tucked securely inside the dark leather of Clara's purse, resting against her hip, were the printed email and the monumental bank receipt, waiting patiently for their inevitable moment to completely dismantle the glittering facade. Clara and David stepped through the heavy oak doors of the private dining room at the Sterling Country Club, immediately enveloped by a stifling wave of forced heat and expensive perfume. The space was an opulent display of excess, completely out of touch with the grounded, agricultural reality of Oakhaven. Extravagant floral centerpieces of imported white roses dominated the circular tables, while delicate crystal wine glasses caught the brilliant light of the grand chandeliers overhead. 40 guests, dressed in their absolute Sunday best, filled the room with a loud, suffocatingly fake hum of polite, meaningless chatter. Near the front of the room, Margaret and Arthur were holding court. Margaret wore a sequined gown that looked entirely too new, her smile stretched tight as she graciously accepted compliments. When she spotted Clara walking in, that perfectly practiced smile froze for a fraction of a second, panic flashing clearly in her eyes. She glided across the plush carpet, offering a stiff, theatrical hug that barely involved any actual physical contact. She whispered a sharp, hurried greeting, her eyes darting nervously around the room to ensure none of her wealthy friends noticed the tension. Clara merely nodded, allowing David to gently guide her to a quiet, dimly lit table near the back. Glancing across the sea of elegantly dressed retirees, Clara found a familiar, deeply comforting face. Martha, dressed in a tasteful, modest wool suit, was seated just a few tables away, her sharp, observant eyes taking in the entire spectacle with quiet, measured judgment. The clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine china signaled the beginning of the evening's toasts. Eleanor, radiating arrogant, nervous energy in a tight designer cocktail dress, eagerly seized the microphone from the wooden stand. She gushed over her parents' long marriage before seamlessly pivoting the spotlight directly onto herself. With a dramatic, breathless pause, Eleanor announced to the affluent crowd that she and Richard were officially purchasing a sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion in the county's most exclusive neighborhood. The room erupted in polite, admiring applause. Then, Eleanor turned her gaze directly toward the back table. Adopting a voice dripping with manufactured pity, she publicly addressed her younger sister. She declared that, given Clara's devastating bankruptcy, she was benevolently offering Clara her old, run-down house to rent at a special family discount. A collective, sympathetic murmur rippled through the older guests, fully buying into the grand illusion of Eleanor's incredible generosity. Clara sat perfectly still, the sheer audacity of the public performance washing over her like cold water. As the applause died down, Richard nervously detached himself from Eleanor's side. He snuck over to Clara's table, deliberately avoiding David's hard stare, and quickly slid a folded document across the pristine white linen tablecloth. He kept his voice to an anxious whisper, hastily explaining that it was merely a standard consent form. The bank simply required Clara's signature to legally use Arthur and Margaret's home as collateral for Eleanor's massive new mortgage. It was the absolute only way the financing would clear. The trap had finally snapped shut. This was the sole, calculating reason the invitation had been re-extended. Clara looked down at the document, the fresh ink spelling out the desperate financial gamble her family was willing to take at her direct expense. She didn't whisper back. Instead, Clara stood up. The wooden legs of her heavy chair scraped loudly against the polished floorboards, a sharp, abrasive sound that instantly silenced the surrounding tables. She looked directly at Richard, her voice remarkably steady, carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet dining room. She announced that she absolutely refused to sign away her parents' home to fund a lavish lifestyle nobody in the family could actually afford. Across the room, Eleanor's carefully constructed poise shattered instantly. She dropped her wine glass, the delicate crystal shattering loudly on the floor, and marched forward, throwing a furious, highly public tantrum. Her face flushed an ugly, angry red as she shrieked, calling Clara a selfish, dirt-digging nobody who was utterly worthless without a bank account to drain. The wealthy guests sat absolutely frozen in horrified shock, forks hovering midway to their mouths. Before Clara could even respond, Martha calmly rose from her chair. The 75-year-old retired teacher commanded the entire room without raising her voice a single decibel. She looked at Eleanor with profound, crushing disappointment, publicly shaming her for measuring a human being's worth by their financial utility, and fiercely defending Clara's 20 years of honest, grueling labor. The moral weight of Martha's reprimand hung heavy in the stifling air, leaving Eleanor speechless and profoundly humiliated. With the room now dead silent, Clara reached into her leather purse. Her hands did not shake. She bypassed the consent form entirely. Instead, Clara smoothly slid the $10.5 million bank receipt across the pristine white linen tablecloth, positioning it perfectly where the surrounding guests could clearly read the staggering corporate transfer. She watched with cold, clinical precision as her mother's face completely drained of color, turning a sickly, ghostly white. The town's elite leaned in, and a collective, audible gasp of pure shock rippled through the grand room. Clara didn't stop there. She pulled out her phone, reading aloud the vicious text messages from the family group chat, publicly exposing Margaret's cruel command to never lend her a dime. Then, she unfolded the printed email, revealing to the entire room that her father had known about the multi-million-dollar corporate buyout for 6 months, actively conspiring to keep her ignorant so they could continue begging her for cash. The facade was completely, irrevocably destroyed. Arthur sank into his chair, utterly defeated, while Margaret desperately tried to stammer a pathetic excuse that nobody was willing to hear. Clara picked up her purse, leaving the damning pieces of paper exactly where they lay among the crystal and silver. She looked at her family one last time, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 15 years finally lift from her tired shoulders. David stood beside her, his hand resting proudly on the small of her back. Leaving the stunned, silent room behind, Clara's footsteps on the hardwood floor sounded less like a retreat, and more like a hard-earned victory march. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can never buy back trust once it has been utterly spent. The terrifying silence Clara had feared on the first day of her fake bankruptcy had now transformed into the greatest source of peace in her life. Within 48 hours of the explosive anniversary dinner at the Sterling Country Club, Clara's phone lit up relentlessly. Messages from Margaret and Eleanor flooded her screen, overflowing with meticulously crafted apologies and sweet, hollow promises. They had suddenly remembered the true value of family the exact moment they realized their dirt-digging daughter was holding on to $10.5 million. But Clara shed no more tears. She and David met with their attorney and legally established a closed, irrevocable trust. Every future request for financial assistance from her family was formally and legally denied. The ironclad boundary had been erected, finally protecting her from their endless, calculating demands. Without Clara's signature as a guarantor, Eleanor's extravagant mortgage application was swiftly rejected by the bank. The hefty deposit for the luxury mansion was lost, and the whispered rumors of the family's deep, pretentious hypocrisy quickly spread through the local diners and coffee shops of Oakhaven. Margaret and Eleanor were finally forced to face the exact same judgmental, pitying stares they had so cruelly cast upon Clara. Yet, amidst the ruins of her blood relations, a tender shoot of genuine goodness quietly bloomed. Weeks later, Clara received a carefully handwritten letter from Chloe, her young niece, on pale blue stationery. The letter made no mention of money or the adults' bitter feuds. The little girl simply wrote that she missed her Aunt Clara, the only person who always praised her and believed in her potential. Clara's heart softened. She realized that cutting ties with toxic people did not mean closing her heart to innocent souls. Together with David, Clara quietly set up an anonymous, restricted educational fund specifically for Chloe, ensuring the bright young girl would have the opportunity to attend college without ever knowing where the money came from. True kindness, she learned, is best given in absolute silence. On a brilliant, crisp winter morning, Clara and David sat on the wooden porch of their new home, a peaceful, 200-acre farm nestled in a neighboring rural county. The crisp air carried the earthy, rich scent of turned soil and morning frost. From down the long gravel driveway, Martha's familiar, modest sedan slowly approached. The elderly neighbor brought with her a freshly baked, fragrant apple tart and the exact same warm, maternal smile she had offered Clara during the darkest of storms. Dear friend, have you ever felt the crushing weight of carrying everyone else's expectations, only to realize you've lost your own joy along the way? When we dare to cast aside the heavy burden of judgment and toxic relationships, we finally open the door to true, profound compassion and genuine freedom. Perhaps a simple, selfless act of kindness or a genuine smile you offer today will kindle a warm heart tomorrow, just as Martha had saved Clara's weary soul. The old harvest had ended along with the painful betrayals, but for the first time in her life, as Clara watched the golden winter sun stretch across her very own fields, she realized the greatest thing she had ever cultivated was her own unshakable peace of mind. Clara's journey reminds us that true wealth is never measured by the balance in a bank account, but by the quiet, unshakable peace we cultivate in our own hearts. When we cast aside the heavy burden of toxic expectations, we finally open the door to true, unconditional compassion, both for others and for ourselves. As I sit here reflecting on Clara's story, I can't help but think about how many of us have walked in her weathered boots. Have you ever felt like you were pouring your endless love, your hard-earned resources, and your precious time into a well that simply had no bottom? It is a heavy, exhausting burden to bear, especially when it involves the very people we call family. But Clara teaches us a vital, beautiful lesson: setting a firm boundary isn't an act of betrayal. It is a profound act of self-respect. Sometimes, the bravest and most loving thing you can do for yourself is to quietly push your chair back and walk away from a table where respect is no longer being served. As we navigate this seasoned chapter of life, let's also remember the Marthas of the world. Perhaps a simple, genuine smile or a warm, listening ear you offer to a neighbor today can kindle a light in someone's dark tomorrow. You never truly know whose heavy heart you might be lifting just by showing up with kindness. I want to ask you something, and I truly hope you'll share your heart with me down in the comments. Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand with someone you deeply loved? How did you find the courage to finally choose your own peace of mind? I read every single comment, and your lived experiences mean the world to this community. If Clara's journey brought you comfort, or if it simply made you feel a little less alone in your own struggles, please take a moment to like this video. And if you find solace in these honest, unfiltered stories of justice, resilience, and personal strength, I invite you to subscribe to Retribution Raw. Here, we honor the courage it takes to stand your ground and the beauty of starting over. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, your peace is always worth protecting.